All right, we're going to get started. First, I'd like to welcome everyone. Nice to see people in the gallery. Thank you for being here. And I'd like to acknowledge that we're on the territory of the Sechelt First Nation. So we have an amended agenda, a few additional reports added. Everybody has the amended agenda in front of them, I believe. Any other additions to staff? No, we've got it all? Okay. So I'd look for a motion to adopt the amended agenda. Moved and seconded. All in favor? Thank you. So we're going to first do a motion to receive all the reports. Moved and seconded. All in favor? Thank you. And we'll move into Annex A. And we'll look to Tina for overview.
Thank you, Chair Seegers. So in front of you here is the final 2018 project carry forwards to be included in the 2019-2023 financial plan. The preliminary carry forwards were presented as part of pre-budget, and as we complete the year-end procedures, we provide an updated list to be included during the round 2 budget deliberations. So in front of you here is the final list, including the values that are going to be included in the financial plan. Details regarding the projects is also included in your summary tables, so in these little pages which are highlighted in pink. So if there's any questions, senior leadership are here to take them. Thank you.
Thank you. So before we get to specifics, if you all grab your big document that you have, note that the carry forwards are in pink. The approved items, the ones we've already approved that are incorporated, are in green. And the ones we're looking at today are in yellow, other than the carry forwards that we may have questions on. So any questions on any of the items on page 3 in our agenda? This is the list of carry forwards. Okay, while everybody's looking, I have a few identified here, and just some questions. We're talking about fire department records management software, and there's a number of them, obviously split up among the various fire departments. Is that software that they're going to be using at the stations? What is the software? Because it's a carry forward, but nothing's been purchased. Staff?
Thank you, Chair Seegers. So in last year's budget, the fire departments had identified moving to a software system that was similar to the district, or to Sechelt Fire Department and the Pender Fire Department, so that's Fire Pro. And just due to the number of software work that our IT department also had, this fell to the end of the year in the work planning process. So it is something that the fire departments would have the ability to use the records in their fire halls, but also connect here in terms of our own server and information. So it's more, the information's more relatable across the fire departments, and it also meets the standard that has been set out in terms of our record keeping.
Thank
so
you.
It's just a work plan and capacity issue.
Okay, so do we have any idea when this is moving forward now? Given it was approved in 2018 budget, has not moved forward for a year, when is this moving forward?
It's on the 2019 work plan, for sure. So it's a cross-functional team. It's not just the fire department. It also would entail our IT department, but also our legislative services staff also need to be involved in that process.
So we'll see that in a work plan coming forward?
Yeah.
Thank you. Any questions from the board? Director Hiltz.
Yeah, on page 3, right at the bottom, the Goodwin House removal. Just wondering about what's about that carry forward project.
And staff?
Do people know what the Goodwin House is for other people?
No.
I'll let staff bring that on. Okay.
Thank you, Chair. The Goodwin House is a surplus building at Shirley Macy Park that through park planning discussions last year was determined to be surplus to SCRD needs, and staff are preparing to have done work on the project in preparation for reuse or removal, reuse off-site or demolition of the building, and that project will be proceeding shortly. Thank you.
Director Hiltz, any other questions? Follow-up?
Just one, what are some of the off-site options that have been discussed?
Staff?
Thank you, Chair. Following direction from the board, staff are looking at options for the building that would maximize social and environmental benefits. And so that could include reuse of the building off-site or deconstruction to reuse materials and prevent them from entering the waste stream. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, any other questions from Director Lee?
I was just wondering if you could refresh me on the bicycle and walking path projects. I don't remember what we're waiting for and when we anticipate we might actually move forward with those.
And is there an item on the agenda?
It's under the background recommendation number 7 on page 1.
Thank you. Staff?
Thank you, Chair Seegers. So staff have been working with 4 other regional districts and MODI staff on resolving building and constructing, maintaining bike and walkway paths in MODI right-of-ways. And so we're nearing reaching agreement on what an MOU would look like, and then also determining the licensing tool, so whether that's an actual license or whether that's a permit, and those things we're hoping to have wrapped up hopefully by the end of March or early April. That's our timeline right now. And so the other regional districts are Comox, Nanaimo, Cowichan, and Kawartha.
That was your question? Good. Any other questions? Directors? I'll have one, the Chapman Lake supply expansion. I know that we've received the letter indicating this is not moving forward, yet I still see it in carry forward. So how do we deal with that given timing?
Thank you, Chair Seegers. So it's going to, staff are recommending that it remain in the carry forwards, and then staff would need to bring back some reports to deal with how the funds are actually reconciled, but also the actual operations issues. So there's a number of components that staff need to sort of analyze and report back on. We're hoping in Q2 that we'll be able to do this, but for right now we're recommending that until it is reconciled, that it stay in the carry forward project list.
Okay, any other questions? Directors? Director Lee?
Thank you. On the carry forwards, I noticed there's project numbers and things on them. Is there some place we can go to find details on those projects based on those numbers?
And staff? Besides the spreadsheet we have, I think you're looking for? Is that?
Yes, I was looking for the details on the projects.
Yes, so there is a column in our apologies. Staff can provide a supplemental list that actually cross-references it against the functional area. So then you can find it with referencing your sheet here, so we can provide that.
Thank you. Okay, I have one further one. Hillside Development Project Investment Attraction Analysis. I notice, again, no work's been done on that this year. How do we proceed, plan on proceeding with that one?
Thank you for the question, Chair. Since the project was approved, staff have gathered background information and prepared a project scope, and that project's currently awaiting internal resourcing and assignment before it would move out. This project is also, consideration was given at the time that it was approved as to whether it might be possible to access grant support for the project. And so that would be one of the first steps that staff would be taking as we move forward with this one. Thank you.
So further information will come forward at a future meeting. Thank you. Director Lee?
Just a follow-up to my earlier question. I was wondering how or when we would find the original project deliverables, how we are tracking to our costs, and the status of those carry-forward projects. That actually was what my question was originally.
Okay, so on the list that's here? On
Yes,
page 3.
that's correct, on the
Okay.
carry-forwards.
Okay, and staff?
Yeah, so when the original carry forward list was provided during pre-budget, we then summarized the budget project status report, which is provided to the board every second month. So that would have been where you would have received it originally. It's not included here because we're going to develop a new one come April once the budget's adopted, and that includes all the carry forward. So it'll be a fulsome report, but we can most certainly provide that as well. In People's Arrow folder.
Director Lee?
No, that satisfied my question. Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you. All right, any other questions? Director Hiltz?
Just a follow-up on the hillside. What kind of time frame of the year, which quarter are you thinking about? I'm thinking I should get prepared for this. So I'm looking for a little bit of a heads up.
Thank you. Staff?
Thank you, Chair. Staff intend to bring forward information in the next quarter on this project. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other carry forward questions? All right, so we have some recommendations on page 1. And that remaining ongoing 2018 projects and associated funding be included in the 2019-2023 financial plan as presented. Someone like to make that motion? Moved and seconded. All in favor? Thank you very much. Move to Annex B. And we want to turn back over to staff.
Yes, thank you, Chair Seegers. So staff have completed the 2018 year-end financial process, and included here are a summary of the surplus deficits for the fiscal year. And per the SCRD's financial sustainability policy, 2018 surpluses are transferred to reserves, and reserves are used as consideration for funding projects, etc., which are tied to plans. So attached here are also a few deficits that have resulted in some of the functional areas, with a little brief summary as far as what some of the highlights as to the rationale as to why those surpluses and/or deficits have occurred. So if further information is required by the board, staff could provide it at a future variance report. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a little more clarification for the board, given that you're all still fairly new. As you know, when we tax by function, those funds have to stay in that function. So at the end of the year, if there's a surplus, it has to stay in the function, so it moves into a reserve for that function. If there's a deficit, then we can't take money from another function, so we need to look at how we cover it. So the report actually outlines the status of all of these different functions at the end of the year, and then either puts the money, if there's money left over, into a reserve for that function, or recommends to us how we should fund it, either from previous reserves or taxation. So any questions about any of the particulars in there? Director McMahon.
Yes, I am interested in the rural planning, 110,000. And there's a suggestion there that staff could provide a variance report to a future committee. So I would be interested in seeing that.
Thank you. And did you want some of those questions addressed now, or do you want to wait for the report?
Well, perhaps a general overview, and then we'll get details when the report comes. How's that?
Thank you. And staff? Thank you. Just looking at what generally caused the deficit. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. With this service, there were unanticipated costs related to the volume of work required and wages and benefits accordingly. There's always a blend of work between the regional planning and the rural planning function, and for 2018 there was a substantial amount of rural planning work, and staff would be pleased to provide further details if a motion was made to bring back a report. Thank you.
Thank you. Director Hiltz.
I was just going to support the motion, yes.
Sorry, any other questions? Yeah, Director Lee.
I was going over the surpluses. I think it's page 47, 48 of our draft financial plan. But it doesn't matter. It's just it was a general question. I noticed some of the surpluses are quite large, like the Lee Bay's got 200,000 surplus. Do we check those surpluses out at some point during the year? And so my question is, should we be increasing user fees in those areas with huge surpluses like that, or actually, should we be, and is it a big surplus?
Okay, so I think, and I'll turn to staff in a second, we, staff are looking at all of the wastewater facilities, wastewater plants, to assess when major work needs to be done. And I think that's work that's going to be done this year. Once that work comes forward, then they'd probably look at, are the user fees, et cetera, sufficient or not, and can do an adjustment at that time. Staff?
Yeah, thank you, Chair, for the opportunity. Just to clarify, for Lee Bay specifically, Lee Bay for 2018 actually incurred an operational deficit of $6,000. So I think what one of the directors is referring to is actually the reserves. So that's what it is. So again, yes, staff are looking at, okay, is $200,000 sufficient to cover the future needs for that facility? And staff are working on that from a capital and operating standpoint. And in short, we know it's not.
Director Lee, does that answer your question?
Yes, I think I have my answer. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions about surpluses, deficits? Director Pratt.
Thank you. Just a brief question on the joint use with the deficit there. Is it just because with the implementation of the new joint use agreement, just getting back up to speed on what the cost implications were, or is this something that we need to look into further negotiation with the school district along as well in order to recoup costs?
Thank you. Staff?
Yeah, I can talk just about the financial piece, and if there's any operational side, then I'll leave that to GM Hall. So from a financial standpoint, we do have to recognize the expenditures and any revenue associated with any financial transaction either side, even though maybe financial dollars aren't exchanging. So for the reason why there's a deficit is there's more use from the SD46 of the regional district facilities than the regional district using the SD46 facilities. So my recommendation is we do a further investigation, but I think that work is already ongoing, so I'll pass that on to GM Hall.
Please.
Thank you, Chair Seegers. Staff from SCRD and staff from SD46 continue to work on developing robust planning and accounting procedures to support the agreement. The agreement is working in the sense of meeting its goals and with programming being delivered in the partners' facilities. And in 2019, there will be a number of meetings between the parties to refine some of these details and ensure that the whole process works as smoothly as it can, and we're not left with variances at the end of the year. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, so we have some recommendations on page 4. And then we're going to add another piece with regards to the variance report to a future committee on rural planning. Okay, so if we can add that piece to the recommendation under the rural planning services. Okay. Any other questions, modifications? Okay, would someone like to make that recommendation? Moved and seconded. All in favor? Thank you very much. So this is an additional item to the agenda, agenda item 4, budget allocations for board advocacy travel, and this came forward as a request from the board. So I think we know what it is on this end. Any questions, any recommendations? Director Hills.
Just a question about the actual expenditures versus the budget and running into deficit and just how that all sort of works its way through.
Staff?
Thank you, Chair. So staff monitor the variance reports throughout the course of the year, and where one particular line item is approaching maximum or exceeding, we just work to balance it out so the bottom line in the service stays within budget.
Director Lee?
After reading through this, I couldn't see the need to do it because it's a small amount, and if we just overrun it, it'd be easy to cover somewhere else. So I didn't see a need to actually bring this higher.
Yeah, I think that this came forward from the committee and the board with regards to the advocacy that we're considering may be required for some of the projects that we're going to be doing this year. So I guess we don't have history at the board table here about how much was done with regards to board travel on that last year that gave rise to the $24,700, because there is a variance, right, from 18 to 29. So we'd probably have to look to staff to see, given what we're anticipating we may need to do here, is that 24/7 sufficient? Director Pratt, did you want to speak before staff?
And just also, I would imagine, my guess would be that at the beginning of a term or at the beginning of a tenure of a director, there would be an additional amount of travel as they're doing their own professional development with learning more about their roles and going around to conferences that they hadn't seen before. So I would imagine the first year of a term would always be a little bit more as well. I'm just curious about that.
Okay, staff?
Thank you, Chair Seegers. It hasn't been my experience that the travel budget is necessarily higher in the first year of a term. There's certain conferences that are always planned for, so UBCM, AVICC, Local Government Leadership Academy, those ones are always planned for. In terms of the number of trips taken for advocacy, obviously it depends based on whatever particular issue is looming. I'd suggest possibly 2 trips to Victoria a year, perhaps, for 2 or 3 directors that were outside of the general board travel that were specifically for advocacy purposes. I can't quantify that at this time, but that's my anecdotal information.
Thank you. Tina?
And also, if I can just bring you to the previous report. So general government actually incurred pretty significant surplus last year. And so just understanding, wanting to be mindful of the budget and bringing this forward, typically general government does, through various reasons, some is just how we operate cash flow, et cetera, does have a modest surplus at each year. So I think what staff are kind of indirectly saying here is we think that, you know, if there's an additional $10,000, that the current budget could probably sustain that. Even though the specific line item doesn't articulate that based on history, meaning even 5, maybe even 7 years, where there has been higher years where there has been more significant travel, maybe due to ferry advisories or different initiatives, that the budget could sustain it. So we're not recommending we tax additional funds for it. If there is concerns, we'll report it as part of variance, and we can revisit it for next year.
Okay, but there is a surplus at this point, or reserve at this point, yeah.
Yeah, there is an operating
Okay.
reserve too, so I think that we have kind of some angles or some cushion, and so it would be prudent just to, you know, let's just wait and see, and there's sufficient money in there to sustain
Mitigate
a little bit.
Yeah, okay.
But again, we'll report on it the next variance if there's any concern.
Okay, we're good. Director Pratt?
I'd just like to say, if seeing that staff is comfortable with that and knowing what they know of our draft strategic plan and our draft big picture goals, if they're comfortable, then I'm comfortable leaving it as is then. Thank you.
So let's move on to Annex C. We have two recommendations in here, one with regards to video streaming and the other rural area director remuneration. So the first is requesting for $25,000 to set up video streaming of the meetings. This is where you're going to look at your little handy-dandy motion sheet and identify what we'd like to do. Director
Okay.
Pratt, go ahead.
Okay, that's, I'm going to start with the video streaming. I'd like to make the motion that the following budget proposal be approved and incorporated into the 2019 budget, and that would be the general government video streaming meetings.
Is there a seconder for that motion? Seconded? Any discussion? All those in favor? Thank you. Then we'll look at the Rural Area Director Remuneration Supplement. This was looking to move it from $26.70 per week to $50 per week. Move from like 50 cents to $1. I had one question on this. On page 3, in the rationale, second paragraph, last line, says directors would require a base budget increase starting in 2020. What would happen in 2019 if this was incorporated? And staff.
Thank you, Chair Seegers. So the 2019 funding required, estimated based on an April 1st, 2019 implementation date, would be $4,660. And if the committee chooses to move forward with this, staff would also request a recommendation to amend the remuneration bylaw to update the figures.
Thank you. Director McMahon?
No, go ahead. Oh.
As you know, I'm in favor of this. I could talk a lot more about it, but I don't know that it's necessary right here and now.
Thank you. So would you like to make that motion that this be incorporated into the 2019 budget and that amendment to the bylaw be brought forward?
That's precisely the motion I meant to make.
Thank you. And is there a seconder? Seconded? Any other discussion? Director Hills.
I won't be supporting it. From my point of view, I'm only 4 months into it. I'd like to get a year under my belt. There's staff is recommending the incoming board have a discussion with these and development of a policy. There's going to be a policy review on it. I would prefer to let staff a process that started last year to wind its way through rather than kind of jump into the middle and initiate it. And materially, I don't think it's going to make a difference to myself, and I hope $25 isn't going to make material difference to a director doing their job. So I'd prefer to let it run the course, a process that began last year.
Thank you. Director Pratt.
I understand the concerns and why it was brought forward, because I do know there is an incredible scope of work for a rural director. However, I will be agreeing with Director Hiltz on this and not supporting the recommendation, as I do feel it was just reviewed last year. I'd like to bring it forward next year and discuss it further then. Thank you.
Director Lee.
Yes, I'm leaning the same way as Director Hiltz. I think we need to let that take its course and see what the outcome is. I think it's too early for us to do this.
Okay, so staff did a review in 2018. So what I'm hearing is that some of the directors would like to see a review come back in 2020. Is that what I'm hearing? Yes, Director McMahon?
I certainly favor a review because I don't think that the current remuneration reflects the reality of the work that is put in, particularly by rural directors. By my estimate, rural directors have to put in at least 10 hours a week over and above what the other directors do, and $25 is sad. I mean, it's simply sad. And so I wanted to put this forward to recognize that there is a problem. I would welcome at another time a discussion of how the remuneration is arranged, and also the comparisons, because regional districts all being different, I know it makes it very difficult, but rural areas are also very different. One of the rural areas in Squamish, Lillooet, is only 300 people, and that's not, a great comparison. So, yes, it's a bigger conversation, but I wanted to put this forward as a recognition of the problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments? Director Theis.
Yeah, I think that a review is in order, and for me, it's mostly about giving every age category and even the working people of working age the opportunity to be able to run for office and actually support themselves in a way that's meaningful. Because historically, it's been very much a job for retired people because they couldn't afford it. And I'd like to see a nice, what's the word? Diversity. That's right. A nice diversity on the board. Men, women, all ages. And in order to do that, I think we need to look at the remuneration. Thank you.
Director Hiltz.
Following up on the review, the June report mentioned that staff recommended directors' remuneration policy be included in the 2019 work plan. So my question is it already in the works?
Thank you. Staff?
Thank you, Chair Seeger. So certainly this was something that staff, again in June 2018, had recognized that the policy work needed to happen. So yes, it is on the work plan, and obviously pending this discussion. If I can, Director Seegers, in that same report of June 28, there is an attachment B that actually does analyze all of the regional districts in that. So there is some information there that might be helpful to the directors.
Thank you. Okay, so we have a motion on the floor at this point, and I understand that all directors are voting on this at this point. Can I confirm that?
Thank you, Chair Seegers. I believe this would be a rural area director vote because
Perfect.
This particular supplement is funded from the electoral area administration.
Thank you. Yeah, and in the agenda it says all, so I'm just okay. So we're looking for rural area directors to vote on this only. All right. So we have a motion on the floor. Director Hiltz.
Could you just repeat the one that we're talking about here, the motion?
Yes. Tara, can I have you repeat that, please?
Thank you, Chair Seegers. That the following budget proposal be approved and incorporated in the 2019 budget. Budget Proposal 3, Rural Area Director Remuneration Supplement for $1,660 based on April 1st, 2019 implementation date, and that an amended remuneration bylaw 636 be brought forward for consideration.
Okay, is everybody clear on what you're voting on? Yes? Okay, all those in favor? All those opposed? Okay, and would you like your vote recorded? No? Okay, so that's defeated. Thank you. And it is already in the work plan for this year, so we'll see that come forward. Okay, thank you. Page 21A. This is agenda item 6, emergency planning and protective services. Now, we had a conversation about this during the budget review. When I came in this morning, there's still some confusion around how this is all playing out. So thank you for the additional report, and I think there's still some questions. So I'm going to turn it over to Tina, I believe, for some further information. Jeanette, thank you.
Thank you, Chair Seegers. So I'm just going to introduce it if I can, and if there's any questions, then staff are certainly happy to answer them. So So thank you. So at the January 10th Planning Community Development Committee meeting, Dave Mitchell and Associates presented 2 reports, one the SCRD Fire Strategic Plan and 2 the Emergency Program Review. At the time, the board directed that a similar presentation be made to the Regional District's 3 partnering local governments and the SCEP Committee, and to report back their consultation, which occurred at the February 28th Corporate and Administrative Services Committee. Today, staff are seeking a decision with respect to the staffing positions for the Sunshine Coast Emergency Planning. Hearing some of the questions that directors might have had at the February 28th meeting, this report was prepared on Friday and sent out in advance. And so, again, certainly we're happy to answer any questions that might have come out of this report as a subsequent. If approved, the planned implementation would move the SCEP position to a manager of protective services, which is an exempt role, and a budget allocation of 60% Sunshine Coast Emergency Planning and 10% allocated to the 4 fire departments. A new .04 SCEP role would be created with 100% budgeted from the Sunshine Coast Emergency Plan. Staff also note that there is already an existing .03 administrative support in the Sunshine Coast Emergency Planning function, and that resource was already there and allocated back in 2016. The reason why staff are recommending the creation of 2 distinct roles is to ensure that there is always proper cross-training coverage, business continuity, while intentionally building redundancy and resilience into the delivery of the program. Should the committee seek a different direction than what staff are recommending, I'm going to note on page 4 of the report that there is reference to an alternate option, which at a minimum staff are still recommending that the 1 FT be created as a manager role and then funded from the service. So again, Chair Seegers, we're happy to answer any questions that the committee might have.
Okay, so you indicated there'd be a .6 manager of emergency planning or emergency planning position. .4 would be added to manager protective services, and then an additional .4, so we're looking at a .8 position of manager protective services, plus .3 in support services.
Thank you, Chair Seegers. So I'm going to just draw your attention to page 21C, where it does have a bit of a chart that does also highlight the FTEs, if that's helpful.
So does that chart on page 21C incorporate agenda item 6 and Annex D and Annex E?
Thank you, Chair. So the purpose of the report was to just articulate, based on what some of the feedback was from Thursday, was from the emergency services side, which is just this is the emergency, this report is the emergency services. Where the .4 would have an impact is actually the fire department budgets, not in the emergency services budget. So this report says, okay, based on the changes in the allocations within the emergency planning budget, this is what the new baseline would be. The budget proposal is just going to impact the fire department. So that wasn't articulated in this particular report because staff's interpretation of what the ask was was what is the implication? So if we say there's a baseline change, if we're hiring a new manager and we had someone that was a coordinator position, there's a financial implication to it. So what is the financial implication to that? So this report doesn't articulate the additional 0.4 because that has impact to 210 to those fire department budgets. So we just wanted to focus just on the emergency planning side of the house.
I'm still confused, but I'll turn over to Director Ties. Thank you.
I think part of my confusion stems from the math under the FTEs on Table 2 on 21C, where if you add up all the numbers, it should come out to 7.4, but it actually comes out to 7.0. So
Yes, you're right.
I'm just wondering, so where are we, so just in real persons and who's doing the jobs, how is that all going to work out? Because I don't think the fire departments are hiring 0.1 extra, but then there's a 1.0 that's under the FTE that is the manager of protective services. So I'm just confused in that regard.
And then also we've got 1.0 as a 0.6 manager and a 0.4 support. So is that one person doing that job, or is it two people, part jobs?
So they are two people doing, the manager of protective services will be doing some fire service administration and as well as emergency planning. And then we will have a coordinator position, just like we had before, that would have, that would be allocated to do some of the emergency planning work. So there are two different positions. So, and I apologize, there is little error there. It is 7.4 on the 21.
Thank you. Any other directors, any questions? Director Beamish.
Is the manager of protective services intended to be the fire chief at this time? Is that the plan?
Staff?
Thank you, Chair Seegers. No, not at this time. No, that's not.
So I guess the first question at the board table here is, do we want to move from core up? Well, I think there is an understanding here that we want to make it an exempt position. I think that's an understanding at the table here, to allow them to do what needs to be done in their job. But the question is, do we move to a manager of protective services, or do we maintain the coordinator position, or emergency planning coordinator? Who'd like to weigh in on that? Director McMahon.
Well, at the risk of repeating myself, I feel that this is based on a report that was researched and written without consulting the major stakeholders, such as the municipalities and the emergency program volunteers. So that's not the right process for making these decisions. We need to actually consult before we write the reports and make the decisions. So I'm looking for a way to move forward, because I do understand that we need the emergency program. We need a coordinator. We definitely do. But I also want to do a better job of consulting with all the people who are involved in this program. So I support an emergency position and set up in such a way that we can review it in a year. That's one suggestion. I'm looking for options here so that we can not hang everything up, but also not commit to this hybrid position that I think a lot of people are at the moment uncomfortable with.
Okay, I'm going to point you to Annex E. So under Annex E, the item D talks about contracted services for statutory, regulatory, and bylaw review. So this would actually look at contracting someone to come in and work on doing some of the background work that's required. Then there's also, on page 26, page 26, I know, there's a lot of paper here. Page 26, this is the amended agenda. Well, the original agenda, same thing. Page 26 is what it says at the bottom. So there's $20,000 out of operating reserves for a contract position to do some of the emergency plan review that are prioritized for action. So that moves some of that forward. As well, inside of the agenda, and I don't know where this would, I don't know where this would show up in a motion. On 21C, we're looking at 0.4 full-time equivalent support for the Sunshine Coast Emergency Planning position. So there's an acknowledgement that that position that's currently in our budget, the Emergency Planning Coordinator, requires some additional staff support to do some of that work. I don't know, is there also an increase in salary if the position moves from non-exempt to exempt?
Chair Seegers, you're right, it does.
Okay.
Moving from those two positions would be. And I believe that is articulated on page 2 of the attachment where it speaks to the budget value in that chart.
We don't have a page 2.
Yeah, sorry. So I appreciate that. Sorry. So it's of the supplement that was sent out. So page 2, there is a value attached in terms of the
21B.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so give you a minute to get your Director Lee.
Just kind of curious if I understand this. I'll see if I've got it right. We're proposing to hire an exempt manager, and 0.1 of their time, of that person's time, will be to each of the Gibsons, Roberts Creek, Half Moon, and Egmont fire departments. So that's 0.4. And 0.6 of that new person's time will be doing protective services. So that's one exempt person now. But we actually have most of that money already in the budget, except for the gap between exempt and non-exempt. And then we're proposing to add a 0.4 of a person as a support person to the staff, which then will give us 1.4 people in total doing emergency services. I think I got that. Do I?
It depends on what the board actually moves forward.
I think that's the proposal, though, right?
Yes. Okay. Okay. Director Beamish.
I guess, and then in addition to that is the consultant work, reviewing bylaws and policies?
The contract position,
Contract
yes.
position. Okay.
Okay. So where would you like to go with this? I'm hearing different views at the table. Director, CAO, sorry.
Thank you. So Director Lee did lay out very helpful. I just wanted to clarify that the $20,000 isn't necessarily for a contracted position. It's actually to support staff through legal reviews of the actual bylaws. So we need some expert support, and we would extend that to our member municipalities in reviewing their bylaws as well. So it's for mostly like a legal review.
Director McMahon.
Right, but that review, that 20,000 is not in the table right now. That's a separate issue.
It's in Annex E. So yes, currently Okay, so I guess let's do it this way. Let's look at if there's support for moving from coordinator or emergency planning coordinator to a position of manager protective services. So I'll make that motion that we move from, we'll see where it goes, move from a position of emergency planning coordinator to manager protective services. And is there a seconder? Second? Okay. Director McMahon, would you like to speak to that?
So you are talking about a combined emergency planning and fire department position.
Yes. So I'm just to see if there's support at the table for doing that. If it gets defeated, then we'll stay with the emergency planning coordinator.
Well,
and then we look at how that all gets funded.
At the moment, I'm going to speak against that because
Okay.
because of the process.
Okay. Would anyone else like to address the position? Director Beamish.
A question again, then where would that position lie within the fire department? At what level in the fire department?
I don't believe that's at the fire department. I believe it's here. Yeah, it's at the regional district to look at coordinating both. Okay. Okay, any other questions about this? Director Hiltz.
Just to make sure, essentially the motion that you're proposing supports the motion that is presented by staff. Is that?
Not necessarily. It's first, I mean,
But
I don't know how.
the blended position is what is supported in the.
Yes.
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 Okay.
Funding, we'll get to funding if this goes forward. If it doesn't go forward, if there's no appetite to move the position the way it's constituted, then we'll have to look at how do we fund what we want to move forward at this time.
So we're doing kind of a two-step here.
Yes.
Okay.
Director Beamish.
And the additional funding identified is over and above the funding difference between the existing coordinator position and this new position. Is that correct?
Well, once we determine whether or not we're moving from emergency planning coordinator to manager protective services, if we don't, then we need to look at how do we fund the emergency planning coordinator as an exempt position. If we move to the manager planning of protective services, then we need to look at how do we fund all of that. Okay, anybody else want to weigh in? Director Ties.
Well, from my impression, the work by Dave Mitchell and Associates was actually quite appreciated and endorsed by at least some of the members of the fire departments that I've talked to. And I think these guys are experts in their field, and I'm tempted to follow their recommendation as well as staff's recommendations on this, and just go ahead with that.
Director McMahon.
There has been a lot of uncertainty in the emergency program for the last few years for a lot of reasons, and I think that coming at it from a top-down perspective is not the way to address the feelings in the emergency program. We might come back again and look at this again, after what I feel is an adequate consultation process. But I just don't, I'm not comfortable with moving forward in this manner.
Thank you. Director Lee.
It's what we're talking about here is an assignment of work, and where the money is coming actually looks like it's going to, where that person time going to be spent. But the bottom line is what we're doing is looking for 1.4 people to handle our protective services. The 0.1s at each fire department is to more tightly integrate the emergency planning into the fire departments, and I think that was basically the recommendation they made, and it made a lot of sense to me. And if we decided to allocate that time in some different manner in the future, that would be our option. so I can see where Don is coming from, but I think if we in the future reviewed what was done and what needed to be done, we could reassign, I believe.
Director McMahon?
Actually, Director Lee raises a good question. I mean, we're getting into the weeds here partly because of the way regional district funding works. We have to assign the funding to each area. So if I take it, if we're assigning a 0.1 to each of the fire departments, then we're sort of committing that this manager is going to do fire work, right? And normally, I think in terms of budget, we should merely be saying we want to do this generally and assigning the money and not have to get into too much specifics about the role of the person we're hiring. That's a little, it's awkward. We find ourselves in a difficult position here.
Any other comments? Director Beamish?
I will say as well that after the presentation that was made to our council favored this new position going forward, so I would vote in favor of it.
Anybody else? Director Pratt?
Based on the historical emergency planning on the Sunshine Coast, I would say that the coordinator position has always been more of a managerial, or at least it had evolved into that over the last number of years based on the amount of outreach the previous holders of that position have had. So I am in favor of putting it into a manager position, and along with when we get to the next motion, I guess, to adding in the 0.4 FTE support. I do recognize Director McMahon's comments, though, that there has been some sentiment out in the community that there was some missed consultation opportunities, and I think that's become we've made that clear to staff. But also the report that we got from Mitchell and Associates was comprehensive. So overall, I would support this going forward, and based on emergencies can happen anytime, and we need to be looking out for our community.
Director Ties?
Yeah, I spoke strongly in the past about ensuring that our volunteers are happy and remain happy, and I think that's where Director McMahon's coming from, and I think that is paramount in what we do, and I think as part of that manager of protective services, hopefully they will also acknowledge that fact and be able to move forward from there. But I do want to speak in favor of the manager of protective services.
Okay. Director Hills, did you want to weigh in?
Yes, I'm not a heavy weighing in, but just, yes, I'm in favor of, and having looked at the emergency, all the presentations over the time, it does seem to be kind of a backbone service. It's one of the original regional services that has served the Sunshine Coast well, and if you're prepared for emergency, you're prepared for the day-to-day stuff. It seems that that's what, in some ways, it leads us to improve the day-to-day improvements.
All right, so I'm going to call the question, and it's that we move from emergency planning coordinator to an exempt position as manager protective services. All those in favor? And opposed? And would you like that recorded? Thank you. So if we're moving to that position, let's look at how we're going to fund it. So I think we don't have anything to do in agenda item 6 with regards to that, because that was for information only. So we'll look at Annex D, page 22 through 24. So on page 23, there is one budget proposal. This is indicating a 0.4 FTE for manager protective services funded by areas A, B, D, E, F, and Town of Gibsons. $32,000 for this year, and potentially $52,000 future allocation. So, who would like to make a recommendation? Director Pratt? And seconded? Director Hiltz? Any comments, questions? All those in favor? Thank you. Okay, and we move on to Annex E. Now, if you look at Annex E, page 25, I want to point you out to mandatory business continuity, so Sunshine Coast emergency planning. So we're saying for this year there will be no financial implication, but for 2020 there would be $15,000 in additional taxation required. And then staff are requesting $20,000 out of operating reserves for the statutory, regulatory, and bylaw review. So we'd be look for a recommendation that the funding request of $20,000 for contracted services be approved and incorporated into the 2019 budget. From operating reserves, yes. Director Beamish, moved. Seconded, Director Ties. Any comments, questions? Okay, all those in favor? Thank you very much. Let's move on to Annex F, forklift cost comparison. And this was an addition to our agenda, so I get caught up on here. So this was the cost comparison that we were looking for with regards to electric versus diesel or propane. Okay, so that answered the questions that were brought forward. Thank you. So let's move to Annex G, because this is the actual cost budget allocations, and there is a proposal at bottom page 31. Funding would be $25,000 total, $10,000 from function 312 and $15,000 from 370. As this forklift is split between two functions. All right. And any questions on this one? Director Pratt? Sorry, Director Mann.
Again, getting into the weeds with forklifts. But, you know, and I'm going to say this so many times you're going to be tired of it, but the UN has declared a global climate change emergency and asked all the world's governments to get to zero emissions by 2030. So we have to figure out how to do that, and we have to start somewhere. One of the obvious targets is our fleet. I don't think we have any electric vehicles in our fleet at the moment. So, you know, every time we make these purchasing decisions, we are committing ourselves to burn fossil fuels, in this case probably for 40 years, because of the lifespan of the forklift. So while I don't want to be or pretend to be an expert on forklifts, I do think that we have to get a plan and get in motion about how we're going to get to zero emissions. Thank you.
Thank you. So how would the board like to proceed with regards to this recommendation? Director Beamish?
I do agree with Director McMahon in terms of the climate change, but this we're talking here of a unit that uses about 300 hours a year, which is very limited use relative to what potentially a vehicle would be used. And I'd like to suggest that in fleet changes, we look at a vehicle for that purpose, but I would move that we proceed with the purchase of the forklift as recommended at the lower price.
Okay, so that's moved. Is there a seconder? Seconded? Any other discussion? All those in favor? Thank you. Annex H, Regional Water Service. Sorry? Did I miss something?
G.
Anybody opposed to that? No, she voted in favor, so yes, she did. Yes. Yes. It was unanimous, so that's why I didn't ask for opposed. Okay, so Annex H. Did anybody want to speak to this? Director Beamish, maybe you could turn your mic off.
Sorry, thank you.
Annex H, page 34. So we have a number of recommendations in here. Should I just work through one recommendation at a time? Okay. So the first recommendation is with regards to the $350,000 for the raw water reservoir phase 3. So this was something we discussed at our last committee meeting. Any questions? Would someone like to make the motion? Question?
I'd just like to check to see if the scope of the plan includes assessing the GHG emissions involved in the various options, because I noticed that the report that we looked at made mention of the GHG emissions caused by flooding a lake, or flooding trees and creating a lake, but it didn't mention the GHG emissions associated with 15 months of heavy construction. So I'd really I'm aware that the report was written by a company that specializes in building artificial reservoirs, so I just want to make sure that we have a very clear picture of the impacts that would have.
Staff?
Thank you, Chair. We'll ensure that it's included in the next phase. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. So is there someone who'd like to make a recommendation that we spend $350,000 to move to phase 3 raw water reservoir? Moved? Seconded? Any other discussion? All those in favor? Thank you. Next one, the next three, two actually, are with regards to additional staff. And at our last meeting, there was a report that came forward indicating the rationale for the hiring of these staff. Are there any questions? So we have a recommendation for a senior utility technician, 0.4 FTE. Would someone like to make that recommendation? Moved and seconded. Any discussion? All those in favor? Thank you. And then utility operations assistant, 0.4 FTE. Staff?
Sorry, Chair. There's one in between the utility engineering technician, top of the page.
On page
37.
35?
37, top of the page.
37. Oh, sorry. Okay. I missed that one. So we're 3. Right. Okay. So let's look at the number 6. Utility engineering technician, 1.0 FTE. Sorry, skip that one. Moved. And do I have a seconder for that? Seconded. Any questions? Yes.
We're on number 6, proposal number 6.
Yes, proposal number 6. Yes. Sorry, my mistake. All those in favor of this one? Thank you. Any opposed? Thank you. Move to number 7, utility operations assistant, 0.4 FTE. Look for a mover of this one. Moved. Seconded. Any questions? Comments? All those in favor? Thank you. There's no number 8, right? Number 8's already been approved. Yes. Let's look at number 9 on page 38. So this is the other part. This is the 370. We approved under 312 in the other motion. This is the 15,000 under 370. Moved? Seconded? All in favor? Thank you. Sorry, I'm getting buried in paper here. Let me get back to the other. Okay, so Annex I, page 55. So this is something that came forward out of our previous discussions with the ice users and the dry floor users with regards to a dry floor multi-use feasibility study. So first I'm going to look to staff for some overview on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Seegers. In responding to the board's request, staff completed very high-level research on the current status of recreation facilities, location opportunities, and construction costs. Taking into consideration the direction of the Parks and Recreation Master Plan that suggests a review of older facilities next year, and the work underway to improve indoor space allocation, staff recommend deferring consideration of a dry floor feasibility study to the 2020 budget process. Some related or supporting actions are recommended to be undertaken in 2019. Specifically, and there are 4 of them. Number 1, a special meeting to be held to review the Parks and Recreation Master Plan. Number 2, proceeding with planned dialogue with School District 46 on the joint use agreement and opportunities flowing from it. 3, a review of SCRD's leases for community recreation facilities. And number 4, continued work on a recreation service plan. Staff are prepared to advance these options using existing resources in 2019 if directed to do so. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions, comments? Director Beamish.
No, I'd move the recommendation.
Okay, move the recommendation as presented. Okay. Is there a seconder for that? Seconder. Okay. Any comments, questions? Director Hiltz.
I just want to thank staff for that work, and it gives us a ballpark number of $5 million is kind of the entry point into a dry land. So it does start the conversation. So thanks to staff.
Thank you. And I think there's some appetite in the community to potentially look at some options. So that gives us this year to see what kind of community support is there to potentially move something forward in the community. Okay. Any other comments, questions? All those in favor? Any opposed? Thank you. Thank you, staff. So Annex J, this is regards to the Lower Road Ocean Beach Esplanade Connector Trail. And there's a recommendation for a budget proposal for $20,000 funded from gas tax, electoral area D and E. Any questions? None? Okay. Director McMahon?
What did the Parks Unit number 439 vehicle replacement have to do with this? I just got confused when I was reading through this.
Staff?
Thank you for the question, Chair Seegers, and apologies for any confusion. In the interest of providing a wrap-up on all budget proposals for Service 650 Community Parks, the formerly approved and incorporated proposal is listed here in the interest of completeness. Thanks.
Thank you. So I'd look to Director Hiltz, Director McMahon. Sorry, no, Director Ties and Director McMahon. How would you like to proceed? Director McMahon?
I'm fine. Do we have any remaining questions about how we can spend gas tax money on trails and whether there's maintenance issues and so forth?
CEO?
Thank you, Chair Seeger. So that actually is part and parcel of the coming report. It is also something that the other regional districts are facing in terms of things as well, as using community works funds for assets that are in effect not owned and managed by the regional district. So this has to be, if this would to move forward, this would need to be in concert with the rest of the work that is also happening, whether it be the tenure issues and also the funding issues.
Director McMahon?
And so this might not move forward, but we're making it, we're flagging it as a project that we want to do. So what will happen when because we all have gas tax funds sitting there, so what's going to be the process going forward if we find an approval for use on trails and so forth?
Staff?
Thank you, Chair. So staff are confident that we have spent a lot of time working with Modi and the other regional districts to find a solution. So we are confident we're going to find that solution and come to an agreement. The reconciliation of the GasWorks funds is something that we would also need to do. So there would be a subsequent financial report that would go along with the existing projects that have been spent money, whether they are cross-referenced and managed within the tenure agreement. We already know that there might be some that are not going to fit to the design criteria, if you will. So we would have to reconcile those individually, and then also reconcile that with the funding that is in the rural areas GasWorks funds. So there's a couple of steps here to move through. The first one is to get agreement on the MOU and the design criteria. The second is the individual projects, and the funding that's associated with that. So this project would need to definitely fit into that work.
Director Ties, I think, had a question first.
Yeah, I think you answered my question, but yeah, the ones that were historically approved, the projects and have just been on hold, we do get another input on those because I think priorities might have changed.
Staff?
Yes, so that's for sure. Certainly we would bring back a report on the various projects that have been on hold and sort of where they fit in. And in some cases there might be particular routes or paths that might not fit the criteria that they're actually articulating now and would become the new standard. And so we would need to find an alternate route or another link to that, into those planning processes. So, yeah.
Director McMahon.
And so I just wanted to check on what process we'll go through in identifying new projects, because, you know, groups come forward and they say, we have this idea, we want to do this. So will we have a planning meeting about that or planning report about that, or will it go to budget, or, you know, what's the steps to identify new projects?
Thank you. Staff?
Thank you, Chair Seegers. The simple answer would be yes. A planning process will be required, and it will have to involve community input. As the CAO referenced, the determining what's possible in terms of new infrastructure will be influenced strongly by the first piece of the process, which is defining design guidelines, which is work that's happening in partnership with the Ministry of Transportation and not solely within the control of the regional district. Thanks.
Thank you. Director Hill.
A question to staff, just on process on voting. F is on here,
This would be rural areas only, A, B, D, E, and F.
And gas tech coming out of D and E?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Thank you. Any other questions? All right, so I'd look for a motion. Moved and seconded. And rural areas voting only. All those in favor? Thank you. Annex K. This is seniors planning table. So this is a request that came forward from the seniors planning table for funding from the 3 local governments, District of Sechelt, Town of Gibsons, SCRD, Town of Gibsons, 15,000, District of Sechelt, 20,000, and Regional District, 15. And it's there is no function for this at this time, so they're indicating that we could use grant and aid for some of it. Perhaps Tina could flesh this out a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you. So staff were asked to provide a report subsequent to the round 1 budget deliberations on this particular request from the seniors planning table. So yes, it was clarified from them that their request from the regional district is $15,000. Some of their indication too was that they were looking for ongoing support. So as it stands right now, the regional district really legislatively couldn't really contemplate that because there's no actual service for this type of initiative. So for 2019 budget, this would have to be funded through grant and aid, understanding that theoretically, it's only for one-time initiatives, grant and aid. Also, our grant and aid process hasn't begun yet. So I guess staff would then caution to make an approval for a grant and aid ahead of receiving all the applications would be something that you'd need to consider.
So one of the things in here, it indicates that the maximum grant is $5,000 that can be awarded through grant and aid.
Yeah, the current policy does stipulate that typically grant and aid requests are only for up to $5,000. So you put a cap on it.
And that's total from all areas, or 5,000 per area?
5,000 total.
Okay.
By all areas.
So how would they, if they wanted to do the 15,000, how would they actually do that? Okay. Dr. Hills.
Thank you, staff, for the recommendation. And going through the policy, it seems to be one of the fundamental difference between regional districts and municipalities. We don't have a silo to bring this out, and to be fair to all the community, I feel we need to receive all the applications so that every applicant has an equal opportunity, and we can review all the applications in total. I was wondering a little bit if anyone does know whether the resource center has charitable status. That's because I did check on the CRA and I couldn't find the resource center as having charitable status there. So they might have nonprofit status. So it's just a question there.
Director McMahon?
Yeah, I happen to know that. They don't at the present, but they are applying for it, so they may have in the future.
I know in past when they've received funding and it was required that they have charitable status, they either did it through the Community Services Society or through the District of Sechelt. Right, so
they partnered.
Yes, they partnered with somebody. Yes, Director McMahon?
Is this something suitable to fund through Scredo?
Interesting. I don't know if it fits their mandate. So I think one of my questions is around timing. So when does the grant and aid actually come forward? Because what happens at the regional board with regards to this request is going to impact Gibsons and Sechelt as well. So what is the timing around grant and aid?
So based on the grant and aid process, so applications will be received. So advertisements are currently going out to the community. Those will be reviewed on, I believe, April the 30th by the board. I think that's the new date set. And then those would come out at the end of May as far as decisions. So that's the current timing. So at the May Corporate and Administrative Services, those would be made public.
So that would be after deliberations on budget at Gibsons and Sechelt.
I believe so, yes.
Okay. Director Hills.
Further, I believe the checks get written in August is when?
That is the current process, unless a community group makes a special request, which is deemed by the board to be paid in advance due to timing.
Thank you. Yes, Director Ties.
Yeah, I just want to clarify that so far nobody's spoken in favor of creating a separate budget for that. So I guess grant and aid is where we're headed.
I think it's the timing that impacts that for this year, and there wouldn't be sufficient time to set up the function for it prior to budget for this year. Is that correct, staff?
Thank you, Chair. If this is something that the board wanted to look at for ongoing continued funding, we would look at establishing a service, and this would require an elector approval process. So I'm not seeing that could be completed in less than 3 to 4 months.
So I think what we're looking at is a one-time at this point, and then so we're looking at two separate pieces. Director McMahon and Director Pratt.
Yeah, we do have a lot of services, and I'm reluctant to set up more services, especially for something that's new, that doesn't have a track record. You know, I think it's been the case in the past that some things have been funded through grant and aid for several years and then moved into a service, and I know that we're not supposed to do that, but this is one of these other awkward spaces where we don't have very much flexibility. So I don't support starting a new service for this at this time. If anybody's got any wild creative thinking, out of the box thinking for how we can fund it, but otherwise we're stuck with grant and aid.
I have a question around the grant and aid bylaw. There's a maximum of $5,000. Can that be changed? Staff?
It's not actually a bylaw, it's a policy. And
It's
so
a policy.
as a policy of the board, of course, the board could amend that policy.
Which could allow them to fund that this year under grant and aid. Then the other question would be, is there sufficient funding in grant and aid to cover off the potential requests this year? Director Beamish?
The town of Gibson, we will be referring this also to our grant of assistance process. And it's one, I think just to keep the process rigorous, we should be treating everybody the same manner in terms of their application process. If this is a grant and aid type of application, then it should go through that process along with everybody else. Otherwise, we get those out of sync. You know, we say, oh, you don't have to go through grant and aid because you can take it to the board, they'll approve it out of line sort of thing. So my recommendation would be to consider pushing it through your grant of aid. Your grant of aid is a policy. You can give more than $5,000. You can violate your own policy. The other thing is that their budget appears to be budgeted for I'm not sure what their calendar year is, but we're already into the second quarter, or approaching the second quarter, and they had 50 weeks for a coordinator. I don't know if they're pushing that over the end of our fiscal year, or whether they, within their fiscal year, will be looking at that. So something to think that their budget might be able to look at that unless somebody knows differently.
Director Lee? Then let's go to Director Pratt then first. Director Lee. I saw
Thank
the
you.
look.
Before my head explodes. Thanks. Okay. So I think we're putting us on a slippery slope to change policy for this year, for this. A question to staff, and then I have a few more comments just to keep me on the list here. So one of, under the discussion piece is, it leads me to believe that we could add to our grant and aid discretionary rural directors funds if we're still in that position. I just wanted to clarify that with staff, that we could add to our discretionary funds at this time. Is that correct?
Staff?
Yes, you can. Yeah,
Okay.
we could do that later today.
Okay. And the work that the seniors planning table is doing is incredibly valuable. When you look at the demographic of our community, we are one of the second oldest populations in British Columbia. So they're doing some incredible work. It would be great to support those services. However, the downloading of services from the larger governments, from the feds as well as from the province, is getting incredibly disheartening. And at the same, so this is something that there should be more funding for provincially and federally, yet it's getting downloaded on to the local governments where we don't really have the same resources to look after it as the feds and the province. So I do caution against starting a new service. I think this is such an incredibly valuable committee, and the work they're doing is so incredibly valuable to our community as a whole. However, if and I would, frankly, I would support doing the grant and aid for this upcoming year. But also at the same time, I think this is another bigger advocacy piece that we need to be looking at with our provincial and federal partners to encourage more participation at that level.
Okay, I'm just going to comment on that. You may or may not be aware that the Seniors Planning Table has done a lot of advocacy around funding from other levels of government for this role. They were successful recently in having the minister, the federal minister for seniors on the Sunshine Coast here, and I was actually part of a brief meeting with her. They are looking at our model that's risen here on the Sunshine Coast as a potential model for across the country. And what this group is looking at doing is attempting to get sufficient funding to keep going until they get the support federally. So there is an understanding that it should be funded at other levels, and they're looking to get there. So I'm speaking in support of, funding at this time, maybe not necessarily the ongoing, if we can get the other levels of government on board. And Director Lee, you had a question, and then Director Tice.
I guess I didn't quite understand the big plan. I was strictly considering what they had said the money was for, which was doing a study to see what the seniors needed, and it would be done this year, which to me is a one-time funding request, which would fall under grant and aid in my mind. So I can't see a problem using grant and aid for this. If the results of it is that there's a whole bunch more work to do, that's good, and we'll look at that when the results are done. I'm not in favor of a change in policy, and I like to keep grant and aid small because it's a discretionary amount by us, and we shouldn't really be having discretionary funds. They're supposed to be by function. So I don't really see expanding grant and aid money to do something that should be covered under a function as per our. So for a one-time thing, I'm okay with it. But that's my thoughts.
Director Tice?
Yeah, I think grant and aid would probably be the way to go, and I think they should go through the regular grant and aid proposal process, and then I think we can maybe entertain a policy change at that point.
So is there any appetite in moving this forward at this point, or do you want to see them come forward at grant and aid? Sounds like you'd all like to have them go through the regular grant and aid process. Okay, so then, are there sufficient funds in grant and aid should they, given timing, because budget will actually be approved prior to the grant and aid process? Are there sufficient funds in the grant and aid to allow for this request and under the current policy, given $5,000 maximum?
It's a loaded question.
I know.
It's a loaded question because understanding that everybody has made, at round one, made a sort of a decision, a policy decision on what your discretionary was going to be. So understanding that this is a pretty significant ask, you may not have enough to make or fund all the requests to the level you want to. However, how will this measure against all the other initiatives and community asks? We don't know because we haven't received the applications yet. So that's what it's hard to give an answer to that as to whether or not there's enough in your discretionary because you haven't seen all the applications. So you don't know what the other requests are going to be because this one's come in advance.
Director Beamish?
This is the type of project that the Community Foundation would look at as well. So especially if you go forward with some partnership already in the plan, the Community Foundation would quite possibly fill the gap of the funding.
All right, what's the wish of the board? And we're looking for the rural directors on this one. Director Pratt?
So if we wanted to add to our discretionary funds at this time in order to support something like this coming forward potentially through grant aid, because now we've got a bunch of ifs. We would need to make a motion at this time. Is that correct?
Staff?
Yeah, if that would be the wish of the committee, I would suggest that at the end of the agenda that we revisit that, and maybe the rural directors could revisit. We could put it on the screen and see what you made decisions. Staff would just need a little bit of time to prepare that, but that would be my suggestion if the committee would wish to do that.
Sounds like that's what directors would like to see. Okay, so we'll add that onto the end of the agenda. Thank you. All right, I know we've got people here waiting for library, but I'm going to look at the directors and see if anybody needs a break before we get into that, because this could be a bit of a discussion. 5 minutes? Thank you. Page 70A. So this report came out in response to our conversation at the last meeting. So I'm going to look to directors to see if they have any questions about the information brought forward. (70A). 70A through D. If any of the directors have any questions. At the last committee meeting, when we talked about library budget, there were a couple of requests put to staff with regards to funding. If you look on 70A under the recommendation listed, Area D was to looking at funding an increase similar to Gibson's and District Public Library. Area A, funding increase including the one-time capital requests, and Area B, funding increase including the one-time capital requests and the both one-time operating requests. So staff went away and took that information and put together the little table indicating what that would look like based on the various areas. Tina, did you have any other information to add to that? Any more clarification?
No, I think that staff are prepared to try to work through if there's any other questions. I think one of the discussion items is based on the recommendation provided on Thursday's meeting last week. There would be somewhat of a little bit of a shortfall based on the full request from the Sechelt Library Association for both the one-time capital and then the ongoing increase to the staffing position and to the materials and supplies, highlighting that the $10,000 to create the reserve hasn't been contemplated as part of the analysis. So we're here to answer any questions.
Director Lee?
I have a whole bunch of questions. The first question I have is that for the annual funding in 2018, the province threw in $73,694, and it's not shown in the 29 as part of the funding envelope. I was wondering what happened to that money. Was it a one-time, or what the heck?
I think all we're looking at this point is the funding that the governments here on the Sunshine Coast fund. We're not looking at what the province is providing. That's outside of the scope of our conversation here. We don't have any impact on that.
When we made our earlier funding decision, we thought we were funding the whole thing, though, and part of the funding wasn't shown when we made our decision. The reason I note that is because the $702,000 last year has grown to $833,893, and it excludes the $73,694 from the figure. And I now note that we're asked that the ask is actually for a over a 36% increase from all of our funders, when I thought we were talking a 14% earlier.
Okay, what page are you looking at for those, where you're pulling those numbers from? Are you on page 71 with that?
It was from the earlier presentations.
Okay. So if you look on page 71, sorry, yep, Tina, sorry, go ahead.
So on page 71, I think is where you were headed. So essentially, this particular budget was presented as part of the original pre-budget. So between pre-budget and the round one, additional requests were made. So I think that's part of what the continuity is a little bit misleading. But again, they still are anticipating receiving $75,000 from the province. They also have other revenues. So essentially, the library's proposed budget, just keeping a base, this 71 doesn't contemplate all those one-time and additional requests. So essentially, their budget is, I think what the director's asking is, what is their total budget request? And I think the answer is yes, he's correct in saying that it is over a 36% increase is really what their request is. It's like, this is what we need for baseline. We've got some one-time requests, and we'd like to increase our service level for a new staffing position and more materials and the reserves. So,
okay. Did that answer your question, Dr. Lee?
Yes, I think the answer is yes. They are asking for a 36% increase in budget 2019 over 2018.
And is that including the one-time capital, or is that in operating?
I don't have the percentages per line item here.
Yes, it's including the one-time
yeah,
capital.
so it's it is including the one-time item. If he's looking at page 70B, that's a little bit misleading because it's essentially the funding per area.
So you're saying that 36% is not,
yeah.
it's not an increase, that's the percentage of the funding.
Correct, per
Yes.
area. For that particular, it would actually, it's a little bit higher, I think. Actually, their overall request is a little bit higher than 36% over the prior years.
Yes, it's 36.4, 36.6, 36.3, 36.4 by area.
Okay. Director McMahon?
Just scope again. So we are strictly talking about this year. We are not talking about going forward.
Yes.
Okay.
This is 2019 only. I think we've already indicated to staff that we're looking at requesting that they look forward to an MOU. Staff?
Yes. However, if you're going to be committing to staffing a position, I think we would have to be clear that if that request was, or the funding was only for one time from the funders, that we would have to be very clear that it's open for negotiation as part of the MOU. But I think that the understanding would be that that would create your new baseline.
Thank you. Director Lee?
If we were talking an apples-to-apples comparison from 2018 to 2019, we're talking $628,472 for 2018, and we're talking $833,893 for 2019. It's a very, very large jump.
Okay. Any other comments, questions? So on page 70A, there is the request. Option 1 on 70B was in response to Area D indicating that they were looking to fund the same amount to the Seashell Library as the Gibson's Library. That shows the results there. And then option 2 is potential that other funders would make up the shortfall based on what Area D was proposing, and that's open to you. one way or another. And then 2B is based on the historical MOU. So the MOU that was just expired at the end of 2018, that would indicate the percentage of the amount as requested, not including the $10,000 to replenish the reserve. So CSHALT and SIGD have indicated that given the support from the regional district, we would both be willing to support our cost apportionment as indicated. So what is the wish of the board? Any other comments, questions? Director Hiltz?
And I'm not a voting member, but I'm just asking, it's probably a question more for the SNF, and I feel late to the party in this question. It was with regards to the website development, and my question was about the role of the co-op, the Evergreen Sitka Co-op, and is that the website that the CSHALT Library is contemplating not using any longer, which is the website front end plus the catalog? So that was just a question, because Gibson's continues to use that function, or that software.
Do you care to answer that question, Al?
Sure. We would contemplate still using BC Libraries Co-op, but we'd like to change the face of it. So the catalog wouldn't change. We would stay with Sitka as a BC Libraries Co-op, but the front facing, but we would see if it needs to change.
Answer your question.
So the back end is going to stay the same. It's part of the co-op. You're trying to modify the template. Is that like a customized template within Sitka and Evergreen, or you'd have to?
It is right now, and that would be the discussion of BC Libraries Co-op to change the template. So we'd be looking at, or what we need to do, a digital strategy that would enable us to have people donate to the page, to change basically what we can, how that page functions for us.
Sure, yeah. My main question was about the library co-op software, yeah. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Any other questions, comments? Director McMahon?
I weigh in here really cautiously because I realize I'm not I'm not voting on this. The two libraries are very similar. They offer very similar programs. They have almost identical open hours. I'm willing to believe that CSHALT is busier, but it's what Tina said, that if you fund this time, then you are in essence committing to funding going forward because of the creation of a new position, and a new position incidentally that's paid very highly compared to other positions in the library system.
So I have to say that this is not a new position. I mean, it's funded newly. This position actually was in existence a few years back, and because of pressures, other operational pressures, the funding was reallocated. So this position was never filled again. We actually used the funding for other positions that required funding in CSHALT. Director Lee.
That's what I've become to understand. I spent quite a chunk of my weekend reviewing this adult programmer and full-time children specifically. The 14% to the base increase for adult programmer, full-time children and youth, increase the book budget and maintain interlibrary loans, and I'll stretch it and say increase the bandwidth. 14% seemed quite reasonable to me to do that. I could even see the capital costs, so even though I think that should come from the community. But anyways, but the supervisor position is actually effectively creating an adult programmer and full-time children. It's just replacing a position that was converted to two other positions from my analysis of it. And if I look at Pender Harbor and consider how we use the library, how I think we use the library, I don't know this for sure. But it seems like access to education about computers says right in the things those living in Sechelt need that. Positive social and emotional community impact, adult programs coordinator. I think we're talking about adults that are wanting to walk in and do social stuff. And the children and youth coordinator is young adult and children's programs such as summer reading programs, which my reading room and community school do in Pender. I'm really, really struggling. How Pender could move past the base 14% with that in mind. It's probably too late because I said yes the other day. But I wish I had done my homework first.
Okay, so in the current MOU that has expired, it was one of the requirements was that we provide children and teen programming. So unless the MOU changes going forward, that is something that we have required basically, the library to have. And they need the funding for that. So that would be a conversation when we're renegotiating the MOU. And that would also be a conversation with the SIB because they're very much in support of that because that provides additional support to their preschool and school-age children.
The dilemma that I have, and I believe anybody else with a reading room is in the same boat. It's like part of the function is being run as a satellite. So how do you fund that? And I'm in the existing and more awkward position that the adult programming is being run as a satellite as well as the actual providing the books and the electronic access. Saying all that, I did say I would do it, and I am prepared to continue with the 4.76% of the total package, with the understanding that District of Sechelt and the Sechelt Indian government and Half Moon Bay are comfortable with a 36% year-over-year raise, so I am comfortable to continuing with the 4.76 in the spirit of cooperation of the bigger package.
So I don't see the 4.76.
That's the old MOU.
The old MOU. So that would be funding as on page 70C, and maybe Tina can give us some clarification on that.
Yeah, so essentially that would be the option 1 there on page 70B. So what happens with some of those is that the 4 point whatnot percent, it does change because of this new dynamic. Those historical things kind of become new percentages. So for instance, on the 70D, the summary, it looks like, for instance, Area A would be probably paying a little bit more than the 4%. Area D's would reduce. Same with Area B's would increase, as well as Area A.
So 70D, the middle portion, in white, is what you're saying.
We were talking 70B.
Right, but I'm trying to get to where he's looking at his numbers. And Tina's punching numbers over there.
Yeah, it's not material, Chair. So essentially, Area A would go up to 4.9% overall.
So
for the overall total.
So what number would we be looking at? Which numbers are we looking at to make this work, I guess, is where we're looking at. If Area D is committing to the same amount as Gibson's, are the other areas funding as per the MOU? Are they funding to make up the difference?
Yeah,
Is that what
so
you're
on
needing clarification on?
Yeah, so if I could bring everybody's attention to the top on 70B. So based on the recommendations, we have a total funding allocation of $833,893, recognizing that that doesn't make up the full request by the Library Association. So
Is
the
that
district is-
$10,000 short?
That's $10,000 short, but it's also $23,000 short because of the 50% SURD or the Area D reduction.
Okay.
Okay. So District of Sechelt, based on the past staff reports, committed to funding 541,065. So we plugged in that number. The Sechelt Nation committed to 15,348. So we plugged in the number for the Area D percentage, which would equate to the 2.5 increase for the area or the Gibson's and Area Library. And so we then allocated what the Area B and A percentage would be, similar to the past MOU. And so essentially what happens is we have a revised percentage of funding. And then the column beside is the allocation per the MOU. So you can see that District of Sechelt used to pay 63.1%. With this new revised amount, they'd be essentially paying 64.88. But again, this is 64.88% of 833. So if any of the funders wanted to increase some of their funding, so Area B, for instance, went from 19.31% to 19.86%. Small increase for Area A overall. However, we're not funding the total request.
So that's option one. So in option two, if we wanted to go up to the 857,471, which does not include the 10,000, but includes everything else.
Correct.
Then Area A and B could cover off the difference, if they choose to, of 11,789 each, which would bring us up to the full amount minus the 10,000.
That's one option.
That's one option. And then 2B changes the allocation of the total amount based on the MOU, which would increase both Sechelt and SIGD as well.
Right. So as we continue to go down multiple different options, I mean, honestly, staff kind of ran out of time to try to continue to calculate table after table. So, I mean, we could, there has to be an understanding that, of course, if you fund more, your percentage of the share is going to come up, how material it's going to be.
Okay, so I think we need to hear from Area A, B, and D on this as to where they'd like to go. We'll start with Area D.
Well, I don't know if I think my choice is fairly clear that I'm going either for option one or option two. But I feel like I don't have being that I've somewhat removed myself out of this conversation, at least with these options. I don't know if you need me to get into my rationale once again, but and get into depth on that, but I'd rather not. But if that's the request, then I'd be happy to.
No, I think I'm just looking, for you to reaffirm that that's where you're going to be. Yeah. So you're staying at that amount, and then it'll be up to Area A and B to determine what they want to fund, and then we'll put that forward to as a recommendation. Not putting you on the spot at all.
I think the conversation has evolved to whether Area A and B picks up the difference of Area D, or whether District of Sechelt Nation A and B share the shortfall equally. I think that's what the two tables are showing.
Chair, staff just wanted to provide some discussion pieces. There was a motion made on Thursday which didn't really address this actually, which would then actually, the motion represents the very first table. It was silent on the second pieces. We just thought we'd be helpful and provide some analysis if that's where the discussion went. Yeah.
Okay. And that would the other bodies would have to review what comes forward from this table to determine whether or not they're willing to increase their funding even more. Director Pratt.
Okay, so it's so we're having to allocate. We've heard very clearly from our Roberts Creek director on what apportionment Area D is willing to put forward. So we're going on this. Not sure whether or not District of Sechelt and the SIGD would definitely put forward any further shortfall. The thing with libraries is they've become part of our social fabric within the community, and as I said before, with the downloading of services from the feds in the province, I've heard from our chief librarian on how they're now helping fill out with forms and internet services, and with the demographics of within the coast, having a very transient population within Sechelt, as well as seniors on fixed incomes, low-income earners, low-income families, and then also knowing from my own friends who will take the bus with their children and go down to the library as a special event. So I'm such a huge supporter of libraries, and it's one of those great equalizers that we have in society, and I really think that they're providing a service that needs to be more fully funded to indicate the level of service they have. And a couple of the discussions we've had on the offhand is creating more partnerships within other organizations, but to help provide more services. So I support funding. I really it really bothers me to raise taxes or ask my constituents for more money, but we are a bedroom community of Sechelt, so I think we really need to support the library. And then there's and then looking forward to this MOU, I'm wondering also to staff whether or not the conversation is going to be coming up in making it a district regional library service as well.
Staff?
So that was part of the report that was provided last week. So we didn't get any recommendation to do any further work on that. The recommendation was that if the board would want to contemplate that we would have to bring a further report on the legislative, sort of the financial, and what that would look like. But we didn't get a motion to that effect. So.
Thank you. Let's finish this one first. Okay. Director Tice.
I have a question regarding that, creating a new service, and would that reduce the amount of going back and forth and this kind of process? And in that case, I'd be in favor of it.
I think it changes a few things, but staff?
Well, so that would be part of the staff report, because I think that, we would, part of the contemplation in creating a service is how you portion the cost, which I think is this is what's being discussed right now through all the jurisdictions. So if the decision was to create a service that set the apportionment model, then you have set your apportionment model.
I think it's a bigger conversation around that as well, what a regional library looks like and how it gets funded and all of those kinds of things. And that would be something we'd also have to look at with the regional, or the library foundation, or the library board as well, staff.
Well, I think that this, my understanding is that there is some confusion about, staff did not recommend a regional service, meaning a regional service in the model of like Fraser Valley, where it's just it would include the Gibsons. Staff weren't recommending that. Staff were suggesting just doing based on the participants that currently pay into the Sechelt Library, that they create a Sechelt and area public library service just like we have in Gibsons. If there was also a contemplation to create a regional, that would even be further work we'd have to do. But again, we haven't received any direction, and staff have not recommended that as a suggested model.
So you would say there's two conversations there. One is, do we do an MOU, or do we actually set up a service and fund it that way?
Yes, we would then, that would be that's one of the options, is instead of doing a memorandum of understanding, that you create a library service like we have in area for Town of Gibsons, or for Gibsons in area.
Okay. Yes, Director Pratt. Sorry, McMahon. Long morning already.
Yes, Gibsons has a funding bylaw with the SCRD, and Sechelt does not, and that's why we go through these antics on a regular basis.
And that the MOU that Sechelt had, that was set up, that expired in December, was an attempt to deal with that. And so in past years, it hasn't been as an issue. We're in the middle of that right now. It's expired, and the new one hasn't come forward yet. So we're looking at a one-time at this point, and then determine what we're going to do going forward. So let's get back to the funding. We know what Area D wants to do. Director Lee.
Two things. Looking at this, I begin to wonder, 2 libraries on the Sunshine Coast? That's a lot of libraries, especially when things are starting to happen remotely now, like book loaning and electronic books and websites. And if we were going to form a service, we'd probably have to look at it end to end on the coast and add things like reading rooms and adult education, and try and make sense of the whole thing. That's my thoughts on a service. My other thoughts are that this doesn't look very good for me personally. I started out with 29,894. Thought 14% might not be bad, 34,079. Got up to 36%, 40, 70, 31. And now I'm being asked to cover a shortfall, which makes me 52,520, which is a 100% increase from where I started in 2018. Jesus, how the heck do I rationalize something like that?
Okay. Director Pratt, where are you going?
Yes, things are going to the technological. However, we still have many members of our community that can't afford computers, that can't afford internet, that still want to teach their children how to read, that still want to be seniors, that have access to books. We have, I think about sitting in the District of Sechelt's committee meeting last week and hearing all the traffic behind me as we're sitting in the community use room. And I can't imagine, like, the District of Sechelt councillors are watching all of these people go back and forth into there, and you can hear the amount of traffic in the middle of a Wednesday afternoon that's going in to use the library. And it's not, It's across the gamut. There's where the library is right now in Seashelt. It's the perfect location. It's on a bus route. It's right at the Early Learning Center at the Seashelt Learning Center. There's the police stations right there. There's so many public events that are happening right there. It's right at the bottom of Town Hall, so people can get assistance with forms. A librarian does more than help with a book. Libraries do more than help with a book. It's a piece. It's a great equalization piece that we have in society, and I will bleed words if I have to, but we really need to fund the libraries in the way that is necessary to help our community grow and gel together.
Director Lee.
Well, first off, I happen to agree with Director Pratt 100%. The difficulty I have is how do the people in Pender get access to those services? We have no bus service. Parents will not bring their children that far. Not the ones I talked to in the last 2 weeks. They're quite happy with the service that the reading room is provided for books, and they're very appreciative of the book loaning and the cooperation from Seashelt to keep those books coming. But that's a remote thing. I guess we need a senior center. That does the same thing that Director Pratt's talking about. But I'd be interested to know, and I don't know, but I'd be quite interested to know if the seniors, the children in Pender Harbour are using the service, because I have no proof they are or aren't, and that's my hesitancy here. If they were using it and it provided it and they were all cool with it, fine. I got this feeling I'm going to have to fund it twice right now. Matter of fact, I got a feeling I am funding it twice. The reading room in Pender is staffed entirely by volunteers, and it's eating up money that had been donated by a very generous person, $100,000, and they're eating it up every year. It's down to 60 now. Do I let the reading room disappear, or do we go for taxpayers' money? That's something I have to face. The community school is supporting the seniors with the forms being filled, the use of computers, the courses being run. That's happening in the community school. Am I funding a double service? I don't know. So this whole thing is very foggy to me. But the thing that's in front of me is $29,000 to $52,000 in 1 year. That's a pretty tough one for me.
So there are two options. We have option 1 or option 2. Director Hiltz.
I'm just going to weigh in on libraries in general, and a little bit about the timing of this year, the MOU, and the potential of a library service for the Seashelt and areas. If it was to go through this year with the renegotiated MOU and the library service was to be coming about, how would those two pieces go together? Would the MOU fall to the wayside and the library service? And is that possible to do it within the essentially to end the MOU and replace it with the library service so whether this would be like a 1-year kind of funding, potentially, maybe not a full 5-year as in the MOU. So I'm just wondering about that. I can't speak highly enough to support funding of libraries for, that is my background, and I have an extreme bias, and it is a democratizing institution that's been around for 100 years, and I can't speak highly enough about supporting it. So I'm just wondering if there's a way to see beyond the immediate increase and think about that in the longer term, kind of how it fits.
Staff, did you want to comment on that, or is that a conversation for down the road?
Well, I think it's more of a process question.
Yes.
So as far as the process goes, I think what staff understand this decision to be is for 2019.
Yes.
We can't, depending on what the decision is, that will potentially, depending on what the decision is, create the baseline for a revised MOU starting in 2020. I think there was understanding by all the funders that based on uncertainty about the apportionment, that it wasn't the right appropriate time to bring an MOU forward, so that would be starting in 2020. If there was a desire to explore Sechelt and area library service, how that would interrelate with the MOU would have to be contemplated, because of course there's a lot of steps in creating a service, and it requires public consultation. Also for consideration is that if a regional district service was contemplating a significant increase in service delivery, so for instance, the most recent increase in service, which had a significant financial implication, the transit service, that went through almost a year of public consultation. So I think some of the comments that I'm hearing is, has this gone through a public consultation scrutiny? I'm not sure. I don't know if it has. So that would be what that creating a service would do, is you would then go to public consultation as to what the community would be willing to do. In 2004, it didn't actually even get to the public consultation.
I have to say that over the last few years, the library has done extensive public consultation. Surveys, online, in-person, outreach, and one of the reasons they've come forward with this request for additional funding is in response to the feedback that they got from the community and the overwhelming support for the services and the provision that is happening up and down the coast, and particularly up in Pender as well. So it's been up and down the coast, and that has been what's behind the request for the funds, because the community is asking for it. I mean, we had in the district of Sechelt, when this came forward to us, they came forward with a petition that had been signed. I don't remember how many people were on there. 1,800? Yeah, 1,800 who signed the petition saying, please fund this. And when it came forward, we kept getting emails from people up and down the coast saying, please support this. So we're overwhelmingly supporting it in Sechelt, and we are looking to the regional district to support that as well. And again, it's over to you, Director Tighe.
So, just to clarify, I'm starting to wonder if I should feel bad about the position that I'm taking, but I also support libraries, and so does our community to an overwhelming amount, and they all say they should be funded, and I absolutely agree. But I was just looking at our usage patterns as well as our per capita spending on libraries, because we're paying into 3 libraries, as well as the amount of commercial tax base we have, which is very little in Roberts Creek. So the cost of our libraries goes almost directly to the people living in Roberts Creek, and that was the basis of my decision. I'd be happy to get into the math of it if you really want to, but it took me a long time to come to this decision, and it was very deliberate, and so I do think that libraries should be supported, but our residents in Roberts Creek are paying amongst the highest, if not the highest amount for libraries on the Sunshine Coast, and I was not able to justify increasing it again by that much. Thank you.
Thank you. So again, I'm going to turn you back to 70B and 70C. So option 1 would have the funders fund based on the MOU, reducing Area D's proportion. And then option 2 would have the full amount funded with the different split between areas A and B. And 2B would involve Seashelt and SIB actually revisiting the amounts that we were looking at putting in. So you have 3 options in front of you. Director Lee.
Thank you, Director Siggers. I got that right for the first time. Option 1 would see a $23,678 shortfall from request, but we are talking about a first-time hire of a full-time position. If it slipped a month or so, it would cover the cost. And I've agreed to quite a dangerous thing already here, in that when it comes MOU time, someone's going to say, hey, you've already agreed. So I would, until we can have, well, let me tell you, I was here back in, I guess it was 2004, when we had this discussion about the Seashelt Library itself, something about rent and something about a few other things. It was a difficult discussion. I think we're going to have another difficult discussion. I'd like it to be the last one if we can. And I think this would be a pretty good solution to take option 1 the way it is and figure it out from there. That's my thoughts.
Would you like to make that motion?
Yes, I'd like to make that motion.
Okay. Is there a seconder for that? Seconder? Any other discussion? Who's voting on this one? This would be... Yes, staff?
It depends. If Area A is making a motion to increase their Seashell Library funding to $40,731,
yes,
that would be just for Area A library service. So then it would
require all voting on it.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, because if it's one, right, we all vote. So you're making a motion that you do. Do you want to only do Area A at this point, or do we want to do Area B, the whole option 1? So that would be that Area D, Fund 71,171, Area A, 40,731, and Area B, 165,578. Is that correct? Page 70B.
Yeah, I'm just trying to pop it up. I think I got it here somewhere.
And that's what you'd be looking for?
Yeah.
Yeah, because they're all 3 separate services.
Yes.
So, I mean, they could be just individual, they can be done as a block, but
I have a question first, if I may.
Yes.
Tina, didn't we pass this at a board already at this amount?
So last week, the recommendation was to fund up to contemplate. Really, yes. I think was staff's understanding of the recommendation. Mm-hmm. But the purpose of this further report was then to translate that into what the financial implication was.
Yes.
To the various services. If I could also, Chair, based on our corporate officer's recommendation, it probably would be better not to do it as a block.
Okay.
And that each specific library service make their own recommendation on their funding level. So
okay. Thank you. So the recommendation that was at the committee is on page 70A, and it was to come back to round 2 budget with apportionment information based on the conversation we had at that time. So there's no motion for funding actually no motion has actually been made on funding. So this is the time to make the motion on funding. So what I'm hearing you say, Director Lee, is that you would like to fund SCRD Area A for Seashell Library $40,731 for 2019. Is that correct?
Okay.
Okay. Is there a seconder for that? Thank you. All those in favor? And everybody votes. Any opposed? Okay, so Area A is done. Area B, are you looking at 165,578? Or what are you looking at?
I don't know.
Should we do Area D first? Okay, Area D, 71,171. Would you like to make that motion?
Yes, I would like to make that motion.
Is there a seconder? All those in favor? Thank you. And then we're back to Area B.
Yay. Oh, great, thanks. Oh. This is tough. Because I'm keeping in mind with how much of a tax increase we already have going into Area B. And I could squeeze out a few tears about the library because I know I've got them in me. I feel them right now. But at the same time, I mean, the other options we have in front of us, you can't ask other partners to fund when they haven't had the conversation yet. So I think at this time I have to support the option one as well with the 165,575, 8.
Okay, is there a seconder for that motion? Seconder? All in favor? Thank you. I think the library is done. You don't need any more for the library. Do you want a motion with regards to exploring the service?
So it's not staff's decision.
Okay. Make that motion.
I'll second that
Seconder.
motion.
Okay. All those in favor? Thank you. All right. So we have one more item that was added to the bottom of our. Sorry, Director McMahon.
I just wanted to put a final remark that the province does not adequately fund libraries,
Yes.
Especially small rural libraries in this province. And we have identified advocacy as one of our priorities for this board. So perhaps that's a conversation we could have at the provincial level.
Yes, thank you. So we have a final conversation here around grant and aid. And then I think, Tina, you wanted to also potentially look at some numbers or show something on here? Okay. Do we need to move away from here for grant and aid? Thank you to all the library people for being here. Oh, yes. Okay. So we'll move away from here. This is grant and aid that we're looking at? Okay, thank you.
Warming up. Yeah, so essentially what you're looking at here, and I'm not quite sure why it's not quite showing up, but I can force that. Okay, so there we go. So essentially the discretionary is this line here for each particular area. And this was the decisions based on round one. So do the functional areas want me to? So 121 is area A, 122 is area B, 123 is areas E and F, 125 is community schools, so there's no discretionary there. 126 is Greater Gibson's community, and again, this is only areas E and F as well. And then function 127 is just area D, 128 is just area E, and 129 is area F.
So what you're saying is the bottom then is what was decided to do with each of those?
It was based on the surpluses from 2018, so they reduced the taxation. So that was essentially, these discretionaries too are quite historical. And so what it would tell you is that for areas A, they may have not, it just depends on what they've done in the past years. They may have increased their discretionary, et cetera, but these are pretty consistent from year to year. They don't really fluctuate a whole bunch. They might plus or minus maybe a few $1,000, because I know that's some areas' question.
So the bottom line is the final bottom is reduced 2019 taxation. So you're saying area A is looking to reduce taxation by 72.
Yeah. So these were the decisions made in round one. Yeah. So they reduced their taxation, but still their discretionary stays at 19,000. So I guess the question is, does everybody want to keep their discretionaries here, or do they want to make any increases?
I think I asked this before, but I've forgotten the answer. So E and F each have a fund, plus we have one that's E and F. Why?
So I think historically, in the 10 or 11 years I've been here, they've been funded in different allocations. So sometimes you'll see one service, like an E and F, depends. Sometimes they'll fund islands projects. Things like Sea Cavalcade, for instance, would be funded through GGCP because it's sort of a Greater Gibson's initiative. Yeah, exactly. So tennis courts or stuff that community groups, so more regional in nature. Again, if the board so wished to revisit these various pots of money and consolidate them, there's nothing stopping you from doing that.
And I think the reason we're bringing take that bottom line where it says reduce 2019 taxation, and for each of the areas, instead of reducing it by the amount, reduce it $1,000 less.
What I'm going to suggest, based on historical, because I know challenge is you don't have a lot of the context of how these things go. So I think that if there was a desire that when you review the grants and aid, you'd like to contemplate, because I don't believe we're making the decision on the planning table right now, but if you wanted to contemplate that, knowing that it would potentially be coming and you'd want to contemplate, that the areas A, B, D, E, and F be the only ones that would increase. I think that historically the GGCP and Area E have always run surpluses typically. So like GGCP, you saw that they actually had a $32,000 surplus. So you most certainly don't want to increase there. There in Area F too, there's been some pretty, so just looking at your surplus too, like
So the top line discretionary is for 2019. So based on those historical values, assuming everything stays the same, we will end up with approximately the same surplus for 2019, which allows a certain amount of latitude already built in without having to add additional funds.
yes, but not having a crystal ball with what's going to be coming. I don't know. You know, is there a lot of, so from a taxation perspective, if you increase your discretionary by 1,000, from a taxation perspective, you haven't done anything too material because you offset it by the last year's surplus. So.
Based on historical, and there seems to be room in there, and to me there seems to be enough room for contemplating the $1,000. Is that enough? And from when I look at those numbers, it looks like there's enough. Short of the perfect crystal ball, right? This is based on, we're using the past history to use as our crystal ball.
So based on historics, I would say that I believe Area A probably could sustain a request like this. I would say that Area B historically would want to probably increase their discretionary. I think because there's multiple pots with E and F, that those areas could sustain a request of this magnitude within their various other pots. I think Area D is the question mark. There was a surplus last year, but can they sustain it? I'm not sure. I would just caution that most certainly Area B, based on historics, probably couldn't sustain it. Area D, question mark, E and F probably could. And Area A is also sort of a question mark, but probably could sustain it.
Plus was 5,697. He's only looking at reducing 3,000. So there's still a couple thousand in there.
So I'd like to, do you need it as an actual motion? I'd like to increase my rural grant, or area, sorry. I'd like to increase Area B's rural grant and aid by $1,000. Discretionary.
All those in favor? Thank you. Any others?
I'm happy with Area E where we stand, particularly since we haven't been through a grant and aid process before. And when we do come to the grant and aid process, I would like to look at these crazy pots. Thanks.
Crazy pots?
Yeah.
And Director Hills.
Yes.
Anything else from staff? All right. Anything else from board? Motion to adjourn.
validate it, but I could provide it if you like.
I'm okay with no surprises right now. I can wait.
Yeah, I have a question. Can we change things still before we finalize? Are we having another meeting? What if we get cold?